it wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to say that the popular view of the relationship between reason and the emotions is that they are in opposition. To be truly reasonable, the emotions must be suppressed or put away in such a manner that they don't interfere with the precious operation of our rational mind. And indeed, there is a long tradition of opposing the rational part of the soul or self within the emotional part, going back to Plato's Charioteer or even before. Throughout the classical period, the opposition was central to some of the major schools of philosophy, particularly the Stoics, who aimed for the state of ataraxia through apatheia, the suspension of unhealthy emotions. However, as the historian Thomas Dixon has revealed, the first problem here, without being too much of a nominalist here, is that nobody experienced an emotion before the Enlightenment. Indeed, it wasn't until the work of Thomas Browne and Charles Bell, both with strong connections to the University of Edinburgh in the 19th century, that the emotions became an important category in philosophy and then psychology. As he's wittily put, as he wittily put it in his book, Week's Recommended Reading, the centuries theorists have debated what should be considered the true seat of the emotions, the soul or the body, the heart or the brain. In view of the importance of Browne and Bell in this conceptual history, I would suggest that the true seat of the emotions was in fact the University of Edinburgh circa 1820. Part of this week's learning is dedicated to understanding what there was before the emotions became a thing. This is not a matter of semantics. One of the important points that Dixon makes is that some of what we now call the emotions, for example, the affections, were cognitive in nature and not therefore in opposition to reason. Indeed, how reason, indeed, how reason and emotions were related is an important aspect of what we're looking at here, particularly whether cognition preceded or preceded or proceeded the emotion, and then the extent that the one governed the other. A second aspect that connects us back to the first few weeks of the subject is metaphysical. From where does morality originate? For some philosophers, reason has been described as the source of morality, but for others, it was the emotions, for rather affections, passions, and or rather affections, passions, sentiments that were the foundations of morality. David Hume, Adam Smith, Charles Darwin all argued strongly that the origins of empathy and indeed altruism lay in what we now call the emotions. Finally, exploring the historical relationship between reason and the things that became known as the emotions also allows to think about another major philosophical and psychological issue, whether emotions are universal in time and place, or whether they are relative to the cultures in which people experienced or experience particular feelings. This remains a matter of some contention. It would be impossible to tell the whole story of reason and what we today call the emotions. You'll see why it's really tricky using a word like emotions once we gone through the history. Indeed, some people have even suggested the acronym POE, passions or emotions, to deal with the ambiguity. So we're only throwing a bit of the kitchen sink at this one, taking an episodic approach, focusing upon a few snapshots to allow us to explore some of the ins and outs of the complex relationship. You should as well be able to refer back to Margaret's lectures on Aristotle and Augustine to tease out a few further complexities. Although later in this week's learning materials, I do look at both Augustine and Aquinas, who have had complex and interesting views that might be worth reviving if Thomas Dixon is correct in his argument that the word emotions is not fit for purpose. Blah, blah. We have now posted on the Fuse set of learning materials, blah, 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 blah. Okay, Plato and the Passions. For Plato, the nature of the soul was important, not just for understanding how our reason works in and of itself, but also how our reasoning interacts with desire and our access to the world as it really is. Here we look at one of Plato's most influential ideas that comes out of the Republic, that the soul had three parts. We are often conflicted over what we want, such as when we both want and do not want to eat a whole cake. Plato thinks that cases like this one shows that our soul is divided into parts, in particular into a desiring part, and spirited part, and a rational part. We'll examine Plato's argument for this conclusion and try to make sense of it. This was part of a lecture given in previous years by Laura, blah, blah, who enhanced it. Here are some great film clips. The video starts with a recollection was Plato's belief that all knowledge already existed in, or recollection was Plato's belief that the knowledge already existed in the soul mind of the individual, that basically our souls are immortal, and we had already encountered the perfection of the forms before our human existence. The job of learning was therefore to recollect that knowledge, however hard that might be. Here you might want to go back to the discussion of Plato's cave in the early part of the subject. Following Laura's discussion of recollection, she moves on to the thorny issue of the soul and what part reason plays in it. More importantly, this brief overview gives a sense of where our traditional view of the relationships between reason and the emotion comes from.
So today we're going to continue with Plato's view on reason. In particular, we're going to be looking at more details about how he thinks it functions in your mind in general and how it serves to function to put you in contact with reality. So we're going to be looking at his three-part view of the soul and so-called ascent to the good. Last time, we were looking at his account of what the nature of reason is. Remember, he claims that all reason is nothing but recollection. Recollection of something you learned in a past life before birth. So his idea is that reason is faculty for intellectually seeing or grasping or having insight into basic universal truth, like the Pythagorean theorems. And it doesn't depend on observation of the world around you. So second point is reason is not dependent on sensory experience. It's something that you have access to, this realm of the forms, these pure, universal, abstract truths, like the truths about geometry. Then he says, okay, reason is nothing but recollection. That means that you never are able to have any new knowledge. Everything that you seem to come to learn is just a matter of remembering what you knew all along, what you learned before birth. We've got no new knowledge, and all knowledge was originally acquired before you were born in this disembodied state. How many people think this is like the right view about reason? No one. What's wrong with it in your view?
It says that you can't learn anything.
That we can't learn anything. That's got to be crazy. But it does seem to fly in the face of our ordinary conception of what we're doing. And you might also have some worries about this idea that, hey, we must have learned these stuff before birth. Why would it have been easier to learn the Pythagorean theorem before birth than it is now? Like, what was so special about that time? Is there anything specific about our current situation that prevents us from learning? Why would it have been easier before birth? Not obvious. It's not clear that Plato continued to accept this recollection view for the entirety of his career, but he did continue to accept the two core principles of it. We can rename this view accordingly. So, according to the otherworldly insight view, all inquiry and learning involves rational insight into some other world. So he wants to hold on to the thesis that reason is a matter of intellectually grasping some ideal universal truths. That's what reason is all about, that kind of aha moment where you grasp the Pythagorean theorem and you say, that has to be true. That's the power of reason in action. And you're having insight into the nature of geometry when you do that. Second, reason yields knowledge, which is not based on ordinary sense perception of the world around us. You can't learn about abstract geometry by observing semi-triangular things that you see out in the world, because you never see all triangles all at once. You only see particular triangles, and they're never perfectly triangular. So how could you learn these universal truths by just looking at instances in the world around you? So what you're having insight into is this ideal realm of the forms, other world. So those are the key tenets of this view. But by holding on to these key components of the view, he can give up the idea that you gain this knowledge before birth. You could say, hey, there's nothing special about before birth. Maybe it happens right now when I chew with a proof. Then you have this rational insight into the world of the forms. And it might be what you have an insight into is innate understanding of basic things like the nature of a triangle or how to define a line, basic things together to form more complex propositions. So the otherworldly insight view can get rid of some of the more controversial and implausible bits and still have this core element. Reason is a matter of gaining insight into this other world of abstract, perfect forms, universal truths. Toning down the view, making it as plausible as we can. If we attribute this view to Plato, his claim is then that this otherworldly insight view captures the nature of reason. It explains how we manage to reliably land on true beliefs. It's distinct from normal sensory experience. It forms part of the essential core of our minds, and it's most clearly shown when we do mathematics and geometry. So we want to focus in on three more questions. First, what's the role of reason in our minds in general? Is it the entirety of our mind, or is it only part of our mind? Second, what's this other world that we're supposed to gain insight into? And third, how does gaining insight into some other world help us learn about the world around us? Last two questions I'm going to put on hold for a moment. They're the ones that Plato addresses in the parable of the cave. But we're going to focus on the first question here. Now, all of this is addressed in the Republic. What's going on in the Republic in general? It's an exploration of what it takes to be a just person, someone who is virtuous and well-balanced personality, by exploring what it would take to be a just society. So in general, Plato is relying on this analogy between social organizations and psychological organization. He says, human psychology is very difficult to get a grasp on, but basically whole societies, whole city-states in his time, he thinks are like a personality writ large. So we can study a city-state to get insight into our own psychological organization. He touches on a whole bunch of different issues in there, ranging from metaphysics, ethics, politics, epistemology, and so on. He's got a lot of radical conclusions, like he argues that democracy is like the second worst system of political governance after governments by an insane tyrant. We're not going to go into that. I want to focus directly on his first question. What's the role played by reason in your soul? And in particular, is your mind unified or does it have parts? The reason why this is an important question to him is that his teacher, Socrates, thought that the mind was just reason. Reason was the only thing that was controlling your personality. That's what you were. You are just reason. Plato, however, disagreed. He thinks that the mind has three parts. He says, we learn with one part of our nature, we're angry with another part of our nature, and with a third part, we desire the satisfaction of our natural appetites. So this image of the chair has been a classic image for Plato's view of the soul. Reason is like the charioteer. And the appetites, like desire for food and sex and fun and what have you, is like one of these horses. And then your emotions or passions is like the other horse. And the charioteer is there trying to keep the appetites and the passions in line. Keep them on the right road, going towards the truth, going towards living a good life. Plato's argument rests on the distinct parts principle. So he says, right at the beginning of the section, we've got the extract. He says, the same thing clearly cannot act or be acted upon in the same part or in relation to the same thing at the same time in contrary ways. What exactly does he mean here? His thought is one thing can't both do something and not do it at the same time. So I can't be moving and be absolutely still at the same time. So if you have something that's moving and standing still, you notice there's movement and standing still. There has to be two things doing those two contrary things. What about what I'm doing right now? I'm gesticulating wildly at you, and yet I'm stationary. So aren't I moving and standing still at the same time?
No.
No, why not?
Really no.
So I've got different parts. I've got my trunk standing still and my limbs are flailing around. So if you've got movement and non-movement, you've got to have distinct parts. Another example, take a spinning globe. In some sense, it's standing still, and in some sense, it's moving. So is that a counterexample that proves his principle has to be wrong? The axis is standing still, whereas the points on the circumference are moving. So you've got distinct parts or distinct aspects that are doing these two different things, standing still and moving. So that's about physical motion. Plato wants to generalize this to mental activity. So assent or dissent from a proposition. Sometimes you find yourself torn. Someone is flattering you and say, oh, well, you are the most brilliant person I've ever met. And you kind of feel like, yeah. And you kind of think, well, not really. Is that a case of one thing, both assenting and dissenting, having these contrary attitudes or movements towards the same claim, same belief? Yeah.
Would that suggest that there are parts of your mind that are separate parts?
That's exactly what Plato wants you to say. If you find yourself drawn to the claim and then also doubting it, there must be different parts of your mind that are saying yes or saying no. Similarly, desire and aversion. You might think, oh, I really want that chocolate. It's looking delicious. Let me at it. You want to have it. And at the same time, you think, hold on here. Like, I'm on a diet. I got to stand back. This is not a good idea. So you're saying, yes, I desire it. No, I don't desire it. Again, different contrary movements of the soul is what Plato would say about that. And you'd want to say there are different aspects of the soul doing this, saying yes and saying no. Or attraction and repulsion from, say, a person. Donald Trump is really kind of funny, isn't he? Right? Feeling all kind of warm and fuzzy towards him. And then you think, oh my God, he's a monster. Attraction and repulsion. There's got to be, according to Plato, two parts of the soul that are having these contrary movements. He gives us a bunch of examples where he wants to bring out these contrary movement, conflicts in our soul. So wanting to drink and yet knowing you shouldn't. So think about a sailor on a shipwreck surrounded by water, really being thirsty, wanting to drink the seawater, and then thinking, no, I shouldn't drink the seawater. Second example is wanting to look at decaying bodies and getting angry at yourself for that. He's thinking, at a scene of execution or a war scene where you've got bodies just left out and are decaying on the ground, and you kind of have this gruesome desire to ogle them. You might have this when you're going past on a freeway, everybody's slowing down to look at the accident. You find yourself wanting to look and wanting not to look. Another case, someone takes revenge on you, but it's deserved revenge. You know you did something really bad. You deserve to be punished. You don't want to be punished, but on the other hand, you kind of feel, well, yeah, I should take it. I should tolerate it. I deserve this. Final example from Odysseus, the Odyssey. Odysseus is coming home from his long travels, and after I think it's 20 years, he comes home and his wife Penelope is entertaining all these suitors from around the land. Because after all, he's been gone for 20 years. Everybody thinks he's dead. Odysseus has this feeling he wants to go out and slaughter all the suitors. He wants revenge and protect his wife. But at the other hand, he thinks, well, if I go out and try and slaughter all the suitors, I'll just get killed, right? That's not a good idea. So he smites his breast, tries to rebuke his soul. Don't go on this suicide mission against all these people who are trying to marry your wife. That's a bad idea. So he's tempted to do it, and he says, don't do it. So by the distinct parts principle, each of these conflicts has to arise from a different part of the soul. So he thinks we can get an idea about what the parts of the soul are by analyzing these sorts of conflicts. So we've got reason, which is what pursues the good and the just and the reasonable, decides what is the right plan of action. We've got passion or spirit, which Plato's conception pursues what is honorable. Think about a military figure who feels like I've got a lot of pride and I know what I should do and I want to make sure everybody is acting in an honorable way. Emotions are directed towards this proper pride. And then you have brute desires, which is a desire to pursue just whatever might occur to you. So you will constantly bombarded with temptations or whims or bodily appetites, and you can have a desire basically for anything. Okay, so how do these help explain the cases that we were looking at? Take the first one, wanting a drink and knowing you shouldn't drink. The wanting your drink by this shipwrecked soul is just a brute appetite. They are thirsty, they're dying of thirst. So that's pushing them to want to drink the seawater. But reason reflectively tells you, well, if you drink the seawater, you're just going to hasten your death and ruin your chances of actually getting saved. So you've got reason saying no on the basis of reflection on what's good for the person as a whole, and the desire is just getting pushed around by your bodily appetites. That's what's explaining this conflict, according to Plato. So wanting to look at the decaying body and getting angry at yourself for it. The wanting to look is the product of your brute desire. You're just like curious and want to look at this gory sight. You're just getting pushed around by these whims, whereas your self-respect says, no, that's just disgusting and dishonorable. What about the case of thinking that you should submit yourself to somebody else's justified revenge? Again, brute desires is playing the bad role here. You don't want to get any harm, so you're going to resist that. That's your desire saying, don't hurt me. On the other hand, passion, this understanding about what's honorable, will say, no, you deserve it. Face up to it. And Plato thinks reason will also tell you the same thing. All things considered except justified punishment, because that's going to help you in the long run integrate yourself back into society, make amends to the person that you wronged. So you should not resist. Final case is Odysseus, where reason and the passions are in conflict. So Odysseus is coming home. His self-respect says, okay, I'm going to slaughter all these suitors in order to reassert my social standing, my self-respect. No one's going to touch my wife but me. And his higher order reflective rationality says, okay, don't do that. Of course, slaughtering the suitors is a good idea, but only do it effectively. So don't go on a suicide mission. Now, we might not agree with his judgment about what the right action is in this case. Slaughtering the suitors is not maybe such a great idea, what rationality tells us to do, but Plato thought it was the right thing to do. It's the right action, but reason should pull you back and say, don't do it until you know you can take your revenge effectively. So don't just charge in and start taking revenge willy-nilly when you could get slaughtered for it. So that's a case where your pride is telling you to do the right thing, but not in the right way, not at the right time. And reason is intervening and saying, hang on, let's plan this out. So what he's done then is he's given us cases where each of these different parts of the soul that he's identified come into conflict with each other. They can pull us in different directions. In principle, the same thing can't act in different ways at the same time. He showed that these three parts of the soul have to be distinct because he's given us cases where you've got contrary actions happening. So let's go back to the question that we started out with. What's the role of reason? On this account, reason is not just trying to inform us about what the right action is. It's not just giving us this abstract bit of information. Reason is actually in the fray trying to control passions and appetites. Like the charioteer, reason is giving us what the right thing to do is and motivating us to do the right thing and try to get other parts of the soul, appetites and passions, into line. And in thinking this, Plato's in line with the thinkers in the ancient tradition who all thought that reason not only got us towards the truth, but helped us act in the right ways. That's a view that later became much more controversial. And we'll be looking at an Enlightenment thinker, David Hume, who takes exactly the opposite view. He thinks that reason can only tell you how to get things done. It doesn't tell you what to do, and it doesn't motivate you to do anything. According to Hume, the job of reason is to say, oh, hey, what do you want? Let me tell you how to get that. According to Plato and ancient philosophers, reason tells you what a good life would be, and it motivates you to pursue that. So we've got first question, the role of reason in our minds. We've got a three-part mind. Reason is the one calling the shots, telling you what the right thing to do is and pushing you to do that. It's steering the chariot, as it were.
Scottish Enlightenment. Giants of the Scottish Enlightenment, Hutcheson, Smith and Hume. The following video lectures given by Professor James Stacey Taylor give you a solid introduction to the work of three Scottish Enlightenment professors in relation to reason and its relationship to the passions. Please go through these, identifying the relationship that each of the philosophers chart between the two. Reason and the passions. And getting a sense of how this fed into moral philosophy grounded in what we call today the emotions.
In the 18th century, something really spectacularly interesting happened in Scotland. Now, this might come as a surprise because most people don't think of Scotland as being a spectacularly interesting place. But in the 18th century, it was, because we have the dawn of the Scottish Enlightenment. I like to point out to American audiences that we have yet to have an American Enlightenment. We just have the Scots version. So that's what we're going to focus on. And it's spectacular. You have a small, dank country covered in hills, sheep, and heather, and it produces philosophical and economic geniuses who have influence not just on their compatriots, but have influence on economics and philosophy even today. And one of the giants of the Scottish Enlightenment is Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson was not himself Scots, he was Irish, but he moved to Scotland as soon as he possibly could, which is the hallmark of his obvious genius. Hutcheson was fantastic. Hutcheson is the Scottish Enlightenment equivalent of a blue touch paper on a firework. You light it and it starts burning, and then suddenly the whole thing just explodes. Because Hutcheson has a tremendous influence on many of his contemporaries. In particular, he has influence on Adam Smith and David Hume. Moreover, Hutcheson's views resonate today. We have many prominent bioethicists who have the ears of presidents, such as Leon Cass with George W. Bush, who offer a form of Hutchesonian moral sentimentalism as a justification for their views in bioethics. So Hutcheson, writing in the 18th century, resonates today and is still tremendously influential. So what's important about Hutcheson? The most important thing about Hutcheson is his sentimentalist approach to morality. Hutcheson recognized and accepted, as everybody in the 18th century and now does, that people have five senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and the like. But Hutcheson held that people have three further senses. They have a public sense, a sense of honor, and a moral sense. Now, Hutcheson believed that these are genuine senses, but he didn't think that there was anything spooky or mysterious about them. They're very straightforward in their operation. Let's give you an example. Hutcheson believes that persons have a public sense. You feel pleasure at other person's happiness. You feel pain at their lack of success or their misfortune. And this comes perfectly naturally and without any intermediate judgment. It is, after all, a sense. And notice how your other senses work. You smell rotten milk, which is a common experience in Scotland. You don't sit down and judge this milk is rotten and then have the scent. You just smell it and it hits you and you smell the rottenness of the milk. The public sense for Hutcheson works just like that. You see somebody experiencing misfortune, you feel sadness as a result of this. You see somebody experiencing good fortune and you feel happy as a result of this. This is something that people experience every day, not just with respect to real people, but also with respect to fictional characters. You see movies, the hero does badly, you feel unhappy. The hero does well, you feel very happy indeed, especially it seems if the hero happens to be a little furry dog. People like little furry dogs. But notice what the point is for Hutcheson. People have a genuine public sense. They also have a sense of honor. And by this, Hutcheson means something quite specific. You have a sense of honor when you receive appropriate gratitude for a good deed that you have done. It makes you feel happy. You don't sit down and think that gratitude was appropriate. Rather, you simply receive it and you feel happiness as a result. Again, like the unhappiness or the happiness that you experience from your public sense when you see the fortune or misfortunes of others, your sense of honor leads you to have certain affections. And so too does your sense operate in this way with respect to your moral sense. And here is where we move into the core of Hutcheson's moral philosophy. You persons have a moral sense, claims Hutcheson. You feel approval when you recognize that persons have performed good, virtuous actions. You feel disapproval naturally when you believe, or sense that they haven't. Let's give you a very simple example. You're out for a meal with friends, and somebody collects the money and then is supposed to pay your server. They do pay the server, but they leave a really bad tip. You might feel that's the wrong thing to do. You feel this almost visceral reaction to your friend's poor behavior. You don't sit there and think, is this a rational, self-interested action or not? You simply think that was not the right thing to do. Your moral sense is offended. Now, you might think, where does this moral sense come from? Why are we concerned about the interests of other people? For Hutcheson, the answer is straightforward. We have a calm, stable disposition towards universal benevolence. In this, Hutcheson is reacting against the psychological egoism of Thomas Hobbes, who held that persons were rationally self-interested and always acted in their own self-interest. Not at all, claims Hutcheson. People are instead generally benevolent. Moreover, for Hutcheson, Thomas Hobbes is not only wrong in ascribing rational self-interest to agents, he's also dangerous. Because if we think that we are just purely rationally self-interested and we fail to recognize our natural benevolence, we might not try to develop our benevolent affections. Indeed, we might even try to crush them. Now, one might say in response to Hutcheson, couldn't we just say that our benevolence works to our advantage? After all, we tend to like to associate with benevolent persons. So if you're a benevolent person, you're going to gain certain social advantages. Hutcheson's response is straightforward. Not so. Benevolence can't be reduced to self-interest because benevolence, remember, is simply an affection. It's a moral sense. We don't mediate our senses through the will. Moreover, there might be certain acts of benevolence which actually cut against our obvious self-interest. For example, you might be a donor to the Institute for Humane Studies or to your alumni association. You could have used something else with that money, which would give you more obvious and immediate gratification, but you don't, because you think it's important to support the causes that you believe are worthy or to support your alma mater's fund-driving effort. So you act benevolently, even if you recognize this might not be strictly in your self-interest. For Hutcheson, then, benevolence and self-interest are going to come apart. Hutcheson is incredibly influential. He develops a moral sentimentalist account of morality, which influences David Hume and Adam Smith, two other giants of the Scottish Enlightenment. He's important for us today because he influences many of the debates which affect public policy, such as the views of Leon Kass. And finally, he's simply somebody who offers an account of human nature that we might like to take on board when we're considering how to arrange institutions. After all, if Hutcheson is right, and people are generally benevolent, we might want to arrange our institutions very differently than if we considered people to be, in a Hobbesian sense, rational, self-interested predators of one another. So if Hutcheson's view of this is correct, we're going to have a very different view of society than if Hobbes is correct. And now, let's turn to Adam Smith and David Hume and see where they take the Hutcheson firework. One of the people who was tremendously influenced by Hutcheson is Adam Smith, another of the giants of the Scottish Enlightenment. Smith's famous for two major works, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of the Moral Sentiments. The Wealth of Nations is a great work of economics, so important is this that he's been called the father of modern economics. So if you've ever taken a class in economics, who you're learning about now is the father of that course. This might strike you as being a good thing if you enjoyed the course, or a very bad thing entirely if you didn't like the course But if you didn't like the course, you can't really blame Smith. Blame your instructor, as long as it wasn't me, in which case it's entirely your fault. So Smith is the father of modern economics, but with Hutcheson, he's also one of the main advocates of a form of moral sentimentalism. Smith's sentimentalism, while it does take strong influence from Hutcheson's, is also distinct from it. For Smith, when we see interactions between persons, we enter into vicarious experiences of their pleasures and pains. We sympathize with their pleasures or we sympathize with their pains. For Smith, we link our sympathy to either approval or disapproval. So if somebody responds in a way that we think is appropriate, for example, somebody pays another individual a compliment and they respond in a way that we think is appropriate, thus leading to a mutually advantageous situation, we will approve of that particular response morally. We would consider it to be morally appropriate. However, if a person overreacts or underreacts, we might actually disapprove of their response, and we do so perfectly naturally. So here's a simple example. Somebody offers a minor and unintentional insult or personal slight to another individual in a class, and the person who has been so slighted reacts violently and with a great rage. I think that most people's response to the person who reacted is, this is an overreaction, you're not engaging in a morally appropriate way. Conversely, we might consider a person to be underreacting. One person offers a terrible and gratuitous insult to another, and the person who has been insulted simply shrugs it off. I think that in certain cases, we would consider this to be an underreaction and a morally inappropriate underreaction. Notice that Smith is also careful not just to allow that persons can vicariously enter into sympathy with others, but also that they can judge the reaction of the person with whom they are sympathizing as being appropriate or not. Moreover, Smith is willing to take this to extremes. Smith gives two examples where we're going to sympathize with persons' situations, even though they themselves will not actually experience the emotions that we are feeling vicariously on their behalf. Two examples of Smith stand out here. One of them is of a normally functioning man who, through this. So note not actually experience anything, but we recognize the losses that they've suffered or the deprivation of the goods of life that they are subject to, and as a result, notes Smith, we might feel on their behalf regret and sadness, even though they themselves actually can never experience this. So notice what Smith is doing. Smith is not merely saying that we will sympathize with the actual experiences of persons that we see, but also that we naturally sympathize with persons' experiences of their situation as they should be experiencing their situation. So we might look upon interactions with others, knowing more from the persons who are interacting about the situation in question, and as a result of this additional knowledge, feel that the interactions is either morally acceptable or morally suspect, based on our knowledge and our sympathy with the interactees, given our knowledge of their situation. So far, we've been looking at Smith's view as somebody looking on the actions of others, but Smith is very clear that we can similarly judge our own actions. And now Smith obviously has a problem, because our judging of our own actions is likely to be tainted by our self-interest. How does Smith get around this? Smith notes that it's perfectly natural for persons to look upon their actions from a third-person point of view, what might be termed an impartial spectator point of view, and to see what would an impartial spectator think of my actions in these situations. People might be familiar with little bracelets which say WWJD, what would Jesus do? We can imagine Smith merchandising his own bracelets, WWASD, what would Adam Smith do? Or more precisely, WWIOD, what would an impartial observer do? So Smith is concerned with ensuring that persons can regulate their actions in accordance with this imaginary third-person point of view. For Smith, this is especially the case when we come to consider questions of justice and just interaction between persons. For Smith, we must recognize that persons can have resentment if they are treated badly and gratitude if they are treated justly. We enter into sympathy with persons and approve if a person's response to an interaction is one that we consider to be appropriate. We would disapprove if it's one that we consider to be inappropriate. Smith is very clear that when we consider interactions between people, there's a distinction to be drawn between failing to receive a benefit and actually suffering some injury. If you fail to receive a benefit that somebody might have conferred upon you, Smith notes, it doesn't make that much sense to be resentful towards them. After all, they simply didn't harm you, they just didn't elevate your position. If you resent somebody for failing to confer a benefit upon you, you might be responding inappropriately. Conversely, if you resent somebody for actually injuring you, from removing your property, for assaulting you, and so forth, that seems to be a perfectly just response. So notice what Smith is doing. He's taking our natural moral sentiments, our natural responses to interactions between people, and he's drawing a distinction between resentment towards a failure to secure a benefit as being illegitimate and resentment towards some positive hurt as being legitimate. Putting this in modern terms of rights violations, for Smith, a failure to fulfill a claimed positive right might not be any injustice at all, but a failure to respect persons' negative rights might be a very grave injustice indeed. Smith, like Hutcheson before him, is taking on a moral sentimentalist approach, but is doing so in a distinct fashion. Like Hutcheson, Smith is offering a perfectly naturalized account of morality, which is going to accord with our natural responses as humans. This, I think, is incredibly important in assessing whether or not a particular social arrangement or moral claims are going to be just or not. If we take Smith's view seriously, we should recognize that persons are constituted to resent having injury done to them, but might not be constituted to resent a failure to secure benefits. If this is so, then it seems that provision of benefits is far less important for a state to do than actually to prevent people from incursions by others. The third giant of the Scottish Enlightenment is undoubtedly David Hume. Like Adam Smith, Hume was also tremendously influenced by Francis Hutcheson. However, this doesn't mean that Hutcheson approved of Hume's views. In fact, he's known to have tremendously disapproved of a draft of Hume's major work, Treatise of Human Nature, that he saw, and he's also known to have tried to obstruct Hume's attempts to secure a university position at the University of Edinburgh. Despite these setbacks, and despite Hutcheson's disapproval, David Hume is undoubtedly one of the most good-natured and pleasant of all of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. David Hume's arguments concerning natural religion, in particular his arguments concerning the design argument, are actually intentionally funny. If you haven't read them, you should, because they are high comedy in its greatest form. Moreover, Hume was constantly being badgered by his contemporaries to finish his great history of England. Hume's response to them, when they kept pressing him for a publication date or pressing him for more chapters was quite simple. Look, says Hume, I'm too lazy, too fat, and just too rich to write this anymore. Now, I think that being too lazy and too fat might well describe an awful lot of philosophers, but unfortunately, we're not too rich. Hume was very fortunate in that respect. And Hume enjoyed his wealth. If you see pictures of Hume, he's enormously rotund, and he's good-natured and he's happy. This is a man who enjoys life. Hume, because of his enjoyment of life, endorses Hutcheson's views that persons are generally benevolent towards one another. He's certainly not a Hobbesian. However, Hutcheson's disapproval of Hume doesn't stem from that agreement. It stems from where Hume takes Hutcheson's arguments concerning sentimentalism, because Hume follows the arguments to their natural conclusions, and he does so brilliantly throughout all of his work, be it on morals or be it on epistemology, the theory of knowledge. For Hume, reason is, and always should be, the slave of the passions. We see here clear links to Adam Smith and to Hutcheson, who are also concerned with persons being motivated by their affections and their sympathies. And we can see how persuasive Hume's view here is. Imagine that you're going off to a supermarket in Scotland. Facing you are all sorts of Scottish goodies. Haggis in tins, kilts, little tartan Scotty dogs, little hats with baubles on them, all the sorts of things that Scotland has produced and that only a Scot could really want. You're in this supermarket and you're looking around, and clearly it's not your reason that's going to direct you to pick up certain things and put them into your basket. It's your desires, it's your passions. Now, your reason can certainly help guide and direct your passions. If you want to save money, as any true Scot would, you'll be looking down and finding out how much price per pound the Yorkshire or the Scottish shortbread is, or the oatmeal is. So your reason will help you to satisfy your desires, but it's the desires that are in the driving seat. They're what's doing the work. This has implications, notes Hume, for our moral views. We often say that we're motivated by morality, and we often make this claim truly. So you might say, yogurts out of a fridge. They wouldn't have been motivated by morality, and we often make this claim truly. So you might ask somebody, why did you hand in that wallet that you found to the police? And they might just say, it was the right thing to do. Or you might say, why didn't you take your roommate's yogurts out of the fridge? They wouldn't have spotted that they'd been missing, and you might say, well, it's the wrong thing to do. You're motivated by considerations of morality. What is right and what is wrong helps guide and determine your actions. But notice, says Hume, if that's true, and it seems to be, morality cannot be rationally based. Because remember, it is not reason, but our passions, our affections, that lead us to perform certain actions. So morality is based upon our sympathies, our passions. In Humean terms, our sentiments, to link more clearly with Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson. So we're guided and directed by our sentiments. That might be a problem, though, because as Hume recognized, we have differing levels of sentimental attachment to people depending on how close they are to us. We're very readily motivated to exercise what Hume terms the natural virtues of benevolence towards friends or family members. But we might be less motivated to perform benevolently towards people who are further from us, strangers in the street, for example. And this might be a problem, because if we're dealing with people in a large impersonal society, we want individuals to be motivated to treat others justly, even if they're not members of their family or their close friends. How do we get to this? Hume notes that we have, as well as the natural virtues, such as familial benevolence, what he terms artificial virtues, such as justice. For Hume, justice was narrowly concerned with respecting other people's property. You act justly if you respect the property of others. Notice that Hume's worry that we might not be motivated to act justly comes with a vengeance when we're talking about strangers. We want justice to apply impersonally and impartially, But if it's a natural virtue, and we lack benevolence towards strangers, but we have towards family and friends, maybe our motivation to act justly towards others in impersonal situations will be fairly weak. Hume argues that what we should do is recognize that justice is an artificial virtue. We are motivated, and we wish others to be motivated to act justly because that is the best way of organizing society. If we want our property respected, and we recognize that others have a similar claim upon their property, we should act justly towards them, even if they are complete strangers to us. In Hume's famous example, if you find the property of somebody who's just a terrible person, a seditious bigot, you should return his property to him because it is his property. So, we have this general virtue of justice, which is artificial, and which we try to instill in ourselves and in others, because to do so will maximize general social utility, or at least work to the advantage of social utility. So, for Hume, our passions are indeed guide and direction of our actions. They're the font of our actions. We have a sentimentalist-based, non-rational approach towards morality, and we distinguish between artificial virtues and the natural virtues. Again, like Smith and Hutcheson, if we take Hume's views on board here, we're going to be putting together various social institutions that recognize that persons are generally benevolent, but might need additional push to respond justly towards persons with whom they have no direct personal relationship.
Immanuel Kant, Reason and Morality. Of course, as you may already be aware, there were many philosophers who believed that morality could stem from reason rather than the emotions. This was the work of his famous categorical imperative, which was a direct response to philosophers like Hume. If you haven't watched this before, you should watch it now, but you should note all agreed that we were talking about at least two different things.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but all of our discussions about ethics so far have had one thing in common: God. Divine command theory, for example, argues that what's good and what's not are determined by a deity, whether that's the God of Abraham or a panoply of gods who come up with ethical rules by committee. And the theory of natural law, as advanced by Thomas Aquinas, says that morality comes from us, but only because we were made by God, who preloaded us with moral sensibilities. But many other thinkers have argued that humanity's moral code doesn't come from some supernatural force. 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, for one, thought that religion and morality were a terrible pairing, and if anything, the two should be kept apart. Instead, Kant argued, in order to determine what's right, you have to use reason, and a sense of consideration for other people, and, at least the way I'm teaching it today, jom-joms. Kant took morality pretty seriously, and he thought we should too, all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs or lack thereof. Because he knew that if we look to religion for our morality, we're not all going to get the same answer. But he thought morality was a constant in an almost mathematical sense. 2 + 2 = 4, whether you're a Christian, Buddhist, or atheist. And for Kant, the same went for moral truths. But he made a distinction between the things we ought to do morally and the things we ought to do for other non-moral reasons. He pointed out that most of the time, whether or not we ought to do something isn't really a moral choice. Instead, it's just contingent on our desires. Like, if your desire is to get money, then you ought to get a job. If your desire is to get an A in class, then you ought to study. Kant called these if-then statements hypothetical imperatives. They're commands that you should follow if you want something. But hypothetical imperatives are about prudence rather than morality. So if you don't want money, you can always choose not to work. And if you don't care about getting a good grade, studying becomes totally optional. It'd be a terrible option, in my opinion, as an educator, but still, optional. But Kant viewed morality not in terms of hypothetical imperatives, but through what he called categorical imperatives. These are commands you must follow regardless of your desires. Categorical imperatives are our moral obligations, and Kant believed that they're derived from pure reason. He said it doesn't matter whether you want to be moral or not. The moral law is binding on all of us. And he said you don't need religion to determine what that law is, because what's right and wrong is totally knowable just by using your intellect. Okay, so how do you figure out what's moral? Kant said the categorical imperative can be understood in terms of various formulations, basically different ways of phrasing or looking at the same essential idea. And he came up with 4 formulations of the categorical imperative. Let me tell you about the 2 most popular ones. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is often known as the universalizability principle. And Kant phrased it this way: act only according to that maxim, which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Okay, Kant. Pretty wordy guy, so let's unpack what he was saying. A maxim is just a rule or principle of action, and a universal law is something that must always be done in similar situations. So, as a Kantian, before I act, I would ask myself, what's the maxim of my action? In other words, what's the general rule that stands behind the particular action I'm considering? Let's say you forgot your wallet in your dorm this morning. You don't have time to get it between classes, and you're really hungry. You notice that the student working at the snack kiosk in the Union is engrossed in a conversation, and you could easily snag a banana and be on your way. Sorry, chom-chom. I mean chom-chom. You could easily swipe that chom-chom and be on your way. Is it okay, morally, for you to do this? Well, the particular action you are considering, taking a chom-chom from a merchant without paying for it, is stealing. And if you approve of the maxim of stealing, which you're doing whether you admit it or not, then what you're actually doing is universalizing that action. You're saying that everyone should always steal. If you should be able to do it, then everyone should be able to do it. The thing is, this leads to a contradiction. And remember, Kant's wording specifically says that moral actions cannot bring about contradictions. The contradiction here is no one would say that everyone should steal all the time. Because if everyone should always steal, then you should steal the chom-chom, and then I should steal it back from you, and then you should steal it back from me, and it would never end, and no one would ever get to eat any chom-chom. Therefore, stealing isn't universalizable. So what Kant's really saying is that it's not fair to make exceptions for yourself. You don't really think stealing is okay, and by imagining what it would be like to universalize it, that becomes clear. Now, Kant's view that moral rules apply to everyone equally sounds nice and fair, but it can sometimes lead to some pretty counterintuitive results. To see how this formulation can go awry, let's visit the thought bubble for some flash philosophy. Let's say one morning Elvira and Tony are having breakfast. Then a stranger comes to the door and asks where Tony is so he can kill him. Obviously, Elvira's impulse is to lie and say that Tony isn't around right now in order to protect him from this would-be murderer. But Kant says she can't lie, not ever, not even to save Tony's life. Here's his reasoning. Suppose she's at the front door talking to the stranger. At the time, she thinks Tony's in the kitchen where she left him, but it turns out that he was curious about the caller, so he followed her into the living room and heard the stranger make his threats. Fearing for his life, Tony slipped out the back door. Meanwhile, Elvira, in her desire to save him, tells the stranger that Tony isn't there even though she thinks he is. Based on her lie, the stranger leaves and runs into Tony as he rounds the corner heading away from the house and kills him. Had she told the truth, the stranger might have headed into the kitchen looking for Tony, which would have given Tony time to escape. But she didn't. Now, by Kant's reasoning, Elvira is responsible for Tony's death because her lie caused it. Had she told the truth, only the murderer would have been responsible for any deaths that might have occurred. Now, she could have refused to answer the stranger altogether or tried to talk him out of it. But the one thing that she's never permitted to do is violate the moral law, even if others are doing so, even for a really good cause. Poor Tony. Very sad. But thanks, Thought Bubble. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative is about the universality of our actions. But the second formulation focuses on how we should treat other people. And it goes this way. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. Again, we have to define some terms here to figure out what this is all about. To use something as a mere means is to use it only for your own benefit with no thought to the interests or benefit of the thing you're using. Now, we use things as mere means all the time. I use this mug to hold my coffee, and if it were to stop benefiting me, like if it got a crack in it and it started leaking, I wouldn't use it anymore. It's perfectly fine to use things as mere means, but not humans. This is because we are what Kant called ends in ourselves. We are not mere objects that exist to be used by others. We're our own ends. We're rational and autonomous, and we have the ability to set our own goals and work toward them. Coffee mugs exist for coffee drinkers. Humans exist for themselves. So to treat someone as an end in herself means to recognize the humanity of the person you're encountering, to realize that she has goals, values, and interests of her own, and you must morally keep that in mind in your encounters with her. Now, Kant pointed out that we do use people all the time, and that's okay, because most of the time we use other people as a means for something, but not as a mere means. We still recognize their humanity when we use them, and they agree to being used. So, for example, you are using me right now to get information about Kantian ethics. I am using Nick and Nicole to help me get that information to you. Kant said that you and I and Nick and Nicole, we all deserve to not be used as mere means because of our autonomy. Unlike other things in the world, we're self-governed. We're able to set our own ends, to make our own free decisions based on our rational wills. We can set goals for ourselves and take steps to realize those goals. This imbues us with an absolute moral worth, Kant said, which means that we shouldn't be manipulated or manipulate other autonomous agents for our own benefit. And this means that things like lying and deception are never okay, because if I'm being deceived, I can't make an autonomous decision about how to act because my decision is based on false information. For instance, I might agree to loan you money so you can buy books for school, but I wouldn't agree to loan you money so that you can get a new Xbox. I'm sorry, but no. So when you lie to me about what you're going to be doing with the money you're asking for, you rob me of my ability to autonomously decide to help you. You've treated me as a mere means to accomplish your goals with no thought to my own goals and interests, and that's a violation of Kant's second categorical imperative. So, Kant argued that proper rational application of the categorical imperative will lead us to moral truth that is fixed and applicable to all moral agents. No God required. Of course, not everyone agreed with him, so next time we're going to check out a theory that is in many ways the antithesis of Kantianism, utilitarianism. Today, we learned about Kant's ethics. We talked about hypothetical and categorical imperatives, the universalizability principle, autonomy, and what it means to treat people as ends in themselves rather than as mere means. This episode of Crash Course Philosophy is made possible by Squarespace. Squarespace is a way to create a website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas.